and what power means in this new setting of global studies. If we are going into the direction of saying, okay, these days we have to see the importance of China compared to the US, for example, I think we are going in the direction of the rise and fall of big powers somehow. And I think this is probably not enough because, as you already mentioned, with the input on the colonial studies side, we do need to have these multi-layered actors involved, and also to what extent which of these multi-layered actors has the monopoly of interpretation. And I think this is really worthy to think in the very traditional category of power. And here, of course, you're right, we shouldn't include China, but as you can imagine, it's quite difficult these days, especially for a university institute. But we were discussing quite a lot from the Swiss perspective, because here you have an example. You cannot really say this is a big power. And although we are discussing the colonial impact of Switzerland as well, colonialism in the case of state without colonies, of course there is colonialism present as well. But on the other hand, this kind of small power doesn't fit into the rationale of the big powers' influence and so on. And therefore, I would go actually in the direction what started, at least in some circles of debate, to understand a little bit more what is at least called in the German translation transit economies. And I think exactly that part to investigate more about connectivity, about the power coming out from driving these connections, is quite an interesting part to think outside the box, because these are companies involved which are doing their business far away from where the seat is. And then, of course, you can also start thinking historically the moment where companies became national entities, which is not the case for a very, very long time. That brings me also back to what you mentioned about the importance of the nation state. I completely agree, although we all, I think, started with the declared aim to overcome the methodological nationalism, of course. However, what I find interesting is when it comes to the state, that we are observing that as an analytical category and not as simple an actor. Because I'm very interested to see to what extent the very ideal of the modern nation state as created in the 19th century had to adapt and to change for fitting into this global economy. And there is quite a lot of interesting impacts which doesn't fit at all our thinking. A very small example. We were investigating the very early official Swiss-Japanese connection, because that started in the 1860s, which is quite early. And the Japanese Meiji government, at the end of the day, wanted a high level. And had to agree about exclusive rights given to the Swiss in Japan should be given to the Japanese in Switzerland as well. Of course, the debate was, okay, let's face the reality, will not come many Japanese people to Switzerland. But during this debate, suddenly, one of the governmental members said, oh, we have a huge problem, because in the Constitution of 1848, precedentariness is only allowed to Christians. This was, of course, a consequence of the anti-Jewish legislation in this camp, but that was the moment. You can always feel through the text that was the moment the responsible people were aware of this is a global global situation we have to handle. And then that was a really, really kind of tricky debate, which didn't disappear into the public debate at all. This article just disappeared in the next revision of the Constitution in 1874. Do not talk about that. And I think this is kind of a perspective which could bring us any further. And then again, when it comes to the virus and what happened through this impact of the virus, I think it's very interesting to see what happened on the scientific level. Who gained more importance, of course, life sciences. We were all, as a stage, we're still, at least in the field I know, kind of analytical decoration. So what Matthias mentioned as clean up the mess. And but when you think about where is the money in the university system, where are the free available money you can fill in with new topics, then it's of course on the side of the oil engineering, which is now disappearing. And these are the positions which can now redefine in completely new ways. And to me it's very interesting to see that even the very traditional universities, they now start establishing engineer faculties, which is quite unusual, but also shows that there is a shifting in science policy involved. And I think we should also being more careful about observing this, what happens on the level of science policy, just to see who has the monopoly of interpretation on this scholarly level. But I give over to Matthias.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. Matthias? So many intelligent.
Yeah, I think about how to answer that in very short sentences. So let us imagine me sitting at a desk and having a dream, overcoming the power of a discourse that identifies always globalization with the American imperialist, etc. discourse. First, and my second dream is that people take the results of global history seriously. So there is no globalization emerging somewhere in the 20th century and being interrupted now, but it emerged earlier. It emerged always in a dialectical relationship with national sovereignty, with territorialization. It has never been only the foreign direct investment story, etc. And so far we have nationalism, populism, and globalization at the same time in the late 1880s, in the 1920s, and then again in the 1990s. So you can write a curve out of that. The problem with global studies, I agree, we should change the name because it is so much infected by this neoliberal agenda of the 1990s, or by reading it into it, as if there has not been any post-colonial approach, no historical approach. The question is how to convince people that this term can be cleaned from this, history. And then you are in a dilemma. You can't rename institutions every 2 years. I started a couple of years ago to argument that trans-regional would be a much more accurate description of what happens. And it has not worked. We published a wonderful handbook of trans-regional studies, got wonderful reviews, everyone said that's fine, but no one uses the term trans-regional for the description of what is called global. And insofar, I come only back to your power story. I see myself, unfortunately, as not a very powerful person in changing societal discourses. And that's the problem, I have to confess. I completely agree, Attila, with populism has a much longer history, and populism is the twin brother of liberalism. You can see it already in the French Revolution, you can see it in the mid-19th century, you can see it in America in the 1890s, and it continues until today. What we today see is that right-wing extremists use this populist strength for their political agenda. But this is not a given, you know. Populism is not necessarily right-wing or extreme right-wing. So the strategic political question is how to dissect these two things instead of only saying all these Nazis and let's overcome and put them into some remote areas where we don't send any radio and TV. So, sorry to be very, very short here. For the neoliberal, only one remark. I agree with many of what you said, but think on the other side that BioNTech is the ideal product of a neoliberal strategy, funded by the state. All the research was funded by the state, and then all of a sudden they got subsidies, state subsidies. In fact, it is paid by the taxpayer, and then they made a fortune out of it. They resist in a wonderful neoliberal way to any spread of the vaccine to Africa. So you would say this is a role model of neoliberalism. But would you think that we would be really in a better situation without this vaccine? So without this vaccine of BioNTech, so I would say it's too cheap to criticize neoliberalism. That's absolutely true, but for example, the Russians are so far not able to produce enough of Sputnik even to vaccine their own population. So the question is only when do we need these capitalist mechanisms, obviously, to overcome a crisis. And I'm not sure if this community approach would have helped us in 2020 to come out of lockdown. Only to engage a debate. Hopefully we have coffee and we can fight about that further.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much, Madeleine, Matthias. This was wonderful. We'll have 20 minutes break and we invite you to a coffee that is here on the right side. Thank you.
Sorry that we